Hello everyone, my name is Prashant and I am back again with another video of Raspberry Pi. In this video, I am going to guide you to how to install Raspberry Pi OS and make Raspberry Pi work. I hope you have watched my previous video, Way to buy a Raspberry Pi. If you haven't watched it yet, you can find that video in the video cards. Now, to install Raspberry Pi OS, make sure you get these files. To download these files, I will provide the link in the description. Here, advanced IP scanner to find IP address of the Raspberry Pi, and Raspberry Pi imager to flash OS onto the SD card, and putty to access the terminal of the Raspberry Pi. And putty is an optional thing. We can access shell of the Raspberry Pi using command prompt or PowerShell. And here advanced IP scanner also, it is an optional thing. We can access the Raspberry Pi IP using the host name like Raspberry Pi or Raspberry Pi local. And we need SD card formatter, this is a mandatory thing. And we need VNC Viewer, it is mandatory when you don't have any monitor. And by WPS applicant, I will provide this in the description. And this is also an optional thing if we are using Raspberry Pi imager to flash OS onto the SD card. And if you use any other flasher to flash OS, we need this WPS applicant mandatorily. And now let's get into the installation. Before installation you have an SD card that has a minimum 8 GB of storage and maximum of 32 GB. Now plug in that SD card to your system. Click on cancel and then go to the drive. I have previously installed OS into this, so it is showing not accessible. So now I will format this drive. To format this drive, make sure you install SD card formatter. In my case, that is already installed and here it is. So I have chosen the drive and clearing the volume label. Choose quick format and then format. Okay, now the SD card got formatted and it is free to use. You can find it here. Here we can see that 8 GB is free to use. Now go to Raspberry Pi imager. Make sure you install this Raspberry Pi imager from raspberrypi.com. I will provide the link to it to download. After installing Raspberry Pi imager, open the Raspberry Pi imager and click on choose OS. If you have downloaded the OS from raspberrypi.com, and then go to custom and choose that OS, or else make sure you have good internet connection and choose Raspberry Pi OS 32-bit. And these downloads and get flashed onto the SD card. Now in my case it is already cached on my computer, that means previously I have installed, so it is pre-downloaded. So now I am using this and click on choose storage. Make sure you choose the storage that you would like to flash. Sometimes you may have another drives in your computer, and if you choose that and click on write, you may lose that files in that drive. And before clicking on write, you click on this gear icon or press Ctrl Shift X, and here enable host name, and in my case I am keeping it as default. You can choose your host name and click on enable SSH, and here in the password section give password as the password as you want. In my case I am giving as raspberry. Click on configure Wi-Fi, and it takes automatically the Wi-Fi that has been connected to your laptop, or else you can give any other Wi-Fi, like Wi-Fi name and the password. You need to provide it here. If it is hidden, then check this, or else leave it. You can check your password once and then choose country as India. Set local and keep as it is. Then select skip first run wizard and then save. Now click on write and then yes, and then the flasher is preparing to write the OS onto the SD card, and this may take some time. I will get back to you once the flashing completes. Now click on continue and then close the imager. Click on cancel, and now you need to eject the drive. The drive got ejected automatically. Now take that SD card and insert it into the SD card slot of the Raspberry Pi, and then power on the Raspberry Pi. Make sure that your system and the Raspberry Pi both get connected to the same Wi-Fi in case you don't have any monitor. Now in my case I don't have any monitor, so I have connected my laptop and the Raspberry Pis to the same Wi-Fi network. Now to access the shell of the Raspberry Pi, we need to know the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. But for that we have a shortcut. Instead of using IP address, now we are going to use the host name. As you have seen in the configuration of Raspberry Pi imager, we have enabled set host name as Raspberry Pi. So now open PowerShell window. Either you can use command prompt also, that doesn't matter. Now I have opened PowerShell window. Here I need to type SSH in small letters. By default the username is pi at the rate the host name you have given. In my case I have given the default host name, that is Raspberry Pi. and then click on enter. Here if you get any errors like this, if you have previously done anything, you need to go to this location, users username slash ssh slash known host. Then you need to go there and delete all that. Now I will do it. C users user dot ssh known host. Okay, I will open this file with the notepad. Notepad. Okay, click Control A and then backspace, file, save, close the notepad and go back to the PowerShell window. Now to get back the previous command, click on up arrow in your keyboard. Now we have got ssh pi at the rate raspberry pi. Now click on enter. It will ask to continue, then click enter S. Now it will prompt to ask password. The default password is raspberry. As the Linux is very secure, so it doesn't show password when you type. And now we have got access to our shell. Clear this whole mess, and now we need to make some settings. To make some settings, you need to type sudo raspi config. Now we will enter into the configuration of the Raspberry Pi. Now here in this, in interface options, we need to enable VNC, as we are going to use VNC as our interface. If you have any monitor, it is not mandatory to do these settings. Okay, then go to display options, go to composite, then enable 4K 60p HDMI. Okay, then now click on tab, again click on tab until you go to finish, and then when you go on to the finish, click on enter, and it will ask us to reboot. Then click on yes. Okay, now this we need to clear this PowerShell window. I mean, we need to close this PowerShell window. As the Raspberry Pi board restarts, again it gets connected to the Wi-Fi. Closing this PowerShell window. The Raspberry Pi is booting and it has not yet connected to my Wi-Fi. If you don't know the host name, or if you have forgotten, you can use advanced IP scanner to find the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. I will provide link to download it. You can download it and run it to get the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. When you get the IP address of the Raspberry Pi, instead of we have typed ssh space pi at the rate Raspberry Pi. Instead of that Raspberry Pi, you need to type that IP address so that you will get connected to the shell of the Raspberry Pi. If Raspberry Pi don't work for you, I mean ssh pi at the rate Raspberry Pi, you need to type ssh pi at the rate raspberry pi dot local. Now that Raspberry Pi got rebooted and got connected back to the Wi-Fi, now we need to get connected to it using VNC Viewer. So you need to install this VNC Viewer and open it. And to get connected to it, you can use Raspberry Pi or Raspberry Pi.local or the IP address. If you have changed the host name, you can't connect to the Raspberry Pi using this Raspberry Pi and Raspberry Pi.local. In my case, I have used default host name, so I will use Raspberry Pi to get connected to it. Click on continue. You need to enter it here. In my case, it is already there, so I have used it. Okay. Now I have got access to the Raspberry Pi desktop. This is the environment where you can find all the applications like Tony editor to write Python programs and Chromium web browser and VLC media player and many other applications. So you can use this as another desktop to work on your programs. And here you can see this download button, and this shows updates that we need to do. In my case, I don't need these updates as this is a demo, so you need to click on install and then update. So here in this shell also, this is the shell we have accessed from our PowerShell, and you can connect to VNC Viewer using Raspberry Pi.local. Also you need to type this Raspberry Pi.local here. In my case, it is already typed, so I get connected to it directly. It says no host, sometimes it says, and sometimes it gets connected. Click on continue and we will get access to the shell. So if you would like to get the configuration, you need to type sudo config. You'll get access to the interface, the configuration of the Raspberry Pi. If we would like to get full HD resolution, we need to go to display settings and then VNC resolution. Click on 1920 into 1080. Okay, then display options, composite, enable 4K HDMI, and then click on tab until go to finish. If you would like to reboot now, yes, and then the Raspberry Pi gets rebooted, and once it get connected to the Wi-Fi, it will auto reconnect to the VNC server and we can get access to the desktop. Now you can see as the Raspberry Pi got rebooted, and here we got full HD resolution, and you can do anything you want. And about the files that you require, like Raspberry Pi imager, VNC Viewer, advanced IP scanner and SD card formatter, I will provide these files links to download in the description. I hope you like this video, and I guess I have guided you to how to install Raspberry Pi OS onto the SD card and boot the Raspberry Pi. If you like this video, share this to your friends, those who would like to learn about the Raspberry Pi, and please subscribe to my channel to get more updates like this. Thank you.
Please subscribe to my YouTube. Tell me you get